Good afternoon. Welcome to the Art History Festival. My name is Christina Bradstreet. I'm the head of programs at the Association for Art History. And welcome to our week-long Art History Festival. So this is a week of events celebrating art history, local to global. The festival is organised by the Association of Art History, and it's taking place across the UK and beyond. And we're so pleased to have a partnership for this afternoon's event with our counterparts at the French Art History Festival and the National Institute of Art History in France. So we have about an hour for this afternoon's event. We'll have about a 45-minute talk or 50-minute talk with time for questions at the end. So please do write your questions in the Q&A box as we go along, and we'll have time for those later. So I'm going to hand over now to Viola Telemons, the director of the French French Art History Festival, and she'll introduce this afternoon's speaker.
Thank you so much, Christina. It is a real pleasure for us to join our colleagues in the UK for an event that highlights the work of art historians, curators, professionals in the arts to British audiences. In France, we have our own art history festival, although it's quite different in format. It's taking place every year at the Château de Fontainebleau, at the Fontainebleau Castle, not too far from Paris, in the beginning of June. So please take a look at our program, which you can find on our website, festivaldelhistoiredelart.fr. When Christina and her colleagues and myself talked about our collaboration on a theme, local and global, I immediately thought of asking Dr. Deborah Dorotinsky-Alberstein to join us, because she was with us in Fontainebleau last summer, and she gave an amazing talk on ethnography and photography, which is the base for what she will do now. She also moderated a panel that was extremely intriguing, and there was a lot of questioning, and the audience was really interested in contemporary art and the way one can use notions of indigenous communities, indigeneity, and all of that. So she's really on top of those questions as a cultural anthropologist. She studied at the University of California, Berkeley, and as an art historian, she did her doctorate at National Autonomous University of Mexico. It's a combination that is extremely useful, I think, for the topics that she's interested in. She has been teaching in the field of visual culture, photography, research on gender in Mexico in the first part of the 19th century, on the popular arts throughout the 20th century, but of course with a special focus on art and visual culture in Latin America. She has been working, for instance, quite closely with the Getty Connecting Art History program in Los Angeles on these topics. Among her publications, she has many publications in Spanish, but among her latest publications in English, I can mention Mexico Illustrated, 1920-1950, a work she did in collaboration with her colleagues at UNAM, a work on the major photographer Lola Alvarez Bravo and the photography of an era, but she also worked on the major show on craft design in Mexico, that the second part of the 20th century that took place at MoMA, 2 years ago, and then most recently a book that just came out as an open access publication online on photographer Mariano Jampolsky. So she's very active, and I'm extremely pleased that she accepted to present her talk now to our British public. So thank you, Deborah, and we'll be with you for questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Berly, for this very kind presentation. And The popular art show was displayed in Mexico City, not at MoMA, but that would be great if MoMA took that up again. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for being here with me. And today we will see one of the developments that the history of Mexican photography has taken in these crossroads between history of science, mainly ethnography, the history of Mexican photography, and the history of Mexican visual culture. So I hope you don't mind me reading. It's a lot easier for me otherwise with my English. If I start talking, I get sidetracked. And I will share my screen. One second. And I think we're there. So this is nice because you will see there is a lot of intertwining with the history of British and, well, yes, United Kingdom photography. In the year of 1844, Henry Fox Talbot published The Pencil of Nature, the first book to be illustrated with photographs. One of the things he emphasized about the virtues of photography was its ability to document and prove the existence of people and objects, such as the porcelain pieces on the shelves of this picture. Document an artistic image. Since the 19th century, photography has recorded the faces and bodies of Mexico's inhabitants. Today, I would like to invite you to explore a small fragment of the history of ethnographic photography in Mexico. I will divide the talk into 3 parts. In the first one, I will explain very briefly the links between photography and the nascent discipline of anthropology in the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, and the particular aesthetics it gave rise to in the study of indigenous populations, and how the so-called popular types influence their recordings. In a second part, I will discuss the changes in the ethnographic photographic record in the first half of the 20th century, and the way in which the modern photographic avant-garde made aesthetic use of indigenous bodies. Here, we will look at archival images, photographs in magazines, and we will look at a case study as well, that of the Zapotec women of Tehuantepec, to see the intersections with modern painting in Mexico. Finally, in the third part, I would like us to conclude with a brief look at the transfer of the photographic camera to the hands of and gazes of indigenous men and women, and the photographic images of self-representation through the work of photographer Maruch Santis, a Tzotzil photographer from Chiapas. My intention is that through this journey, you may perceive the complex range of visual possibilities and social and cultural practices in which photography was inserted to question the diversity of bodies and cultures within the country. From the end of the 18th century, there was an interest in documenting the various types of inhabitants of the Kingdom of New Spain. This is while we were still under colonial Spanish rule. The so-called casta paintings, or caste paintings, allegedly map a diversity of racial intermingling, but also signaled the classes into which New Spain society was divided. Most of these paintings ended up in the Spanish royal collections and in the hands of private connoisseurs. Shortly after independence from the Spanish crown in 1821, the Italian artist Claudio Linati arrived in the country. In addition to introducing lithography, a marvelous mechanical multi-reproduction technique, he made sketches and watercolors of various peoples from Mexican society and members of the ethnic groups. Linati's bodies tended to reproduce, perhaps in somewhat a stylized form, the academic teachings of European bodies now brought by the grace of attire to represent the Mexican Indians, as in the case of this Lacandon, the one on top, and the young Zapotec girl from Tehuantepec. Towards the middle of the 19th century, Romanticism in Mexico, as in other parts of the Western and Westernized world, boosted the creation of publications displaying, through descriptions in text and images, the various characters that made up the country's society. The recording of the traits and dresses characteristic of each activity was one of the features of these publications, which, like Los Mexicanos Pintados por Sí Mismos, or Mexicans Painted by Themselves, gave us a picturesque image in engravings, wax figures, and of course, photograph. Studios such as those of Antioco Cruces and Luis Campa in the second third of the century created galleries and collections of the traits and inhabitants of the city, generally portraying scenes set up inside the photographic studio, like the one you can see right here. It's the same character as the one on top. It's a water carrier with his big guards at the back. And here is a beautiful painted backdrop set up in the studio of a famous fountain where many of these men went to get water. This type of image continued to be seen in publications that link geography, history, and the description of social classes, thus relating ethnicity, class, landscape, and territory to national and regional identities, as was the case with those published in Antonio Garcia Cuba's atlases and albums. More than paintings, graphic art bore the burden of this representation of national character. With the arrival of photography in Mexico in December 1839, think about it, very early, if photography was presented by Daguerre and Arago to the the Scientific Society in Paris in August, and the summer, it arrived here very, very fast by boat. But above all, portraiture soon became the recurring themes. These scientific expeditions on Mexican soil, made by English, French, American, and even in some cases, national expeditions, took place during the second half of the 19th century. All used photography because it was judged to be the neutral due to its origin in a technological device. These images found a space linked to comparative anatomy and the nascent science of physical anthropology. I would like to point out some of the ideas and practices developed since the end of the 18th century that influenced the way of treating the head and the human face in particular, which help us understand the preference for the portrait from the front and profile. Physiognomics, developed mainly by the pen of Swiss pastor Johann Caspar Lavater towards the end of the 18th century. Lavater proposed that the moral worth of a human being would be discerned from the study of his face in repose, free from the expression of the passions. And the perfect technique was the tracing of profiles that allowed a measurement of certain angles of the face and their correlation with moral attitudes. You can see here how this was applied, and allegedly some of these angles and proportions bore some signs of moral correctness or incorrectness too. Before the invention of photography, drawings of silhouettes in profile were widely used, collected and discussed at social gatherings, and even commented in scientific circles. With the professionalization of anatomy and comparative anatomy, as well as statistical methods in the first half of the 19th century, think of Quetelet, for example, with his population statistics in the beginning of the 19th century, these came together with physiognomics and also was joined by two pseudosciences that strongly influenced the collection of skulls and their drawings and measurements, craniometry and phrenology. And I say pseudosciences because they have been disproven. The latter sought to determine human character intelligence from the shape of the skull and its supposed correspondence with the brain. And that is the measurement of the head would determine brain capacity, and the larger the brain capacity, the better the brain. This was a very strange correlation, also proven not to be true these days, for a while now. These assumptions imbued the face and the head, and of course their portrait, with a particular value, especially in the production of sculptural busts, such as those that the latter populated the collections of natural history museums and cabinets of cranial specimens. And you can probably attest to this in the very fabulous phrenology cabinet in the National Portrait Galleries of Scotland. I think it's the most amazing I have seen. Well, two further developments also had a strong influence on the production and ways of making sense of photographic portraits within the apparatuses of social control. On the one hand, the Englishman, since Francis Galton, used the technique of multi-exposure of overprinting negatives, or the way it was called composite photography, to find the standard type of family members or criminals or sick people of all kinds, and also of all kinds of human degeneracy, to illustrate his proposed theory of eugenics, or science of the well-born or well-bred. On the other hand, the Frenchman, Alphonse Bertillon, invented what is known as Bertillonage, a system for making police records known as signalétic cards or indexical cards, which contained front and profile portraits. And here you see Bertillon himself posing as an example, to fix the features of criminals, to which anthropometric measurements of the length of arms, the weight, the height, and other anatomical numerical dimensions and proportions of the subjects were added to complete the record of the offender's body. And this serves to prove that although they may use disguises, criminals could never change the proportions of their bodies. And it was a way to fix their identities. During the transition between the 19th and 20th centuries, photography already had several social uses. It had achieved a prestigious position in the production of honorary portraiture, as well as suited to scientific documentation, and was appropriated by biopolitical discourses such as eugenics and evolutionism. This was mastered by the adaptation of modes of studio portraiture and police photography. For example, in these images, we can appreciate the way in which the archaeologist Desiré Charnay structured the family portrait in an interior, and he structured the family portrait as if it was in an interior, but it's set in an exterior. And he emulated the composition of a studio photograph with the father of the family seated in the middle, higher, and the two women that are seated with him. And he even added the twisted backdrop to emulate one of those curtains that were sometimes used in bourgeois portraiture. Something similar happens in the images of the Cochimi Indians, and has a backdrop. One has a backdrop of a column here, a rococo column, with a small vine winding up, suggesting a bourgeois architectural space that contrasts or clashes with the men's clothing. In the other image, we find the post that characterizes the Cochimi men as indigenous. And this would be codified and later taken up by visual culture all the way up to film, so that this post probably meant, hey, this man is a hunter, with his bow and arrows in one hand and the other hand covering his eyes, shielding them from the sun. In this image, we can intuitively guess a narrative, a hunter looking for his prey. The last photograph exemplifies a type of portrait associated with social control in the carceral system, this one. but also used in ethnography. The Mijen man stands in front of a white blanket and a measuring rod on his side, and a measuring rod in his side to give the notion of scale. This lack of props, an apparent lack of pose and staging, a form of staging itself nonetheless, came to signify an absence of both style and artistification by isolating the body and the subject against the natural background. Together, these repertoires reveal the complex variety of images that were brought into play to imagine indigeneity in the 19th century. In another example, printed in albumin, we see a group of Seri Indians with one of them reclined comfortably on pelican skins as if on a shelong. Bows and arrows are again included as stereotypical signs that had already been codified as telltales of savagery, bravery, and indigenousness, especially for indigenous people in the north of the country. The same sign later migrated to the movies. In the photographs that accompany the installations in the rooms of the National Museum, we can recover some of the uses of these varied images hung on the walls to illustrate the population, also represented by the skulls and the material culture displayed in the cabinets. Of the foreign explorers and researchers who took photographs of indigenous populations in the last decades of the 19th century, the images of Léon Diguet for the Musée de l'Homme, those of Carl Lumholtz, taken on various trips through northwestern Mexico for the American Museum of Natural History, and those taken by photographers Bedros Tatarian and C.B. Lang for the books of Frederick Starr, who worked for the Field Museum in Chicago, stand out. Ethnography, photography, and racial typing. Although chairs such as that of physical anthropology may have had their incipient origins in the French Scientific Commission during the Second Empire between 1862 and 1867, the International Congress of Americanists in 1895, the travels of these foreign researchers, and later the creation of the School of Higher Studies in Mexico in 1910, also involved educational interventions at the National Museum of Archaeology, History, and Ethnography. The Czech physician and physical anthropologist Hles Harlitka, for example, instructed Nicolas Leon in anthropometric techniques and the use of instruments for measuring the human body, which helped Leon establish a small instruction manual, the one you see here to your left. Leon also devoted himself to ethnography and promoted studies illustrated with photographs in the museum, such as this monograph of the Popoloca Indians from Veracruz. Although between 1910 and 1921, this is the time of the Mexican Revolution, meant that the work of the National Museum went through an impasse, the government that followed promoted anthropology from different institutions, and scholars such as Manuel Gamio, Carlos Basauri, and Lucio Mendieta y Núñez undertook projects of documentary and photographic mapping of indigenous populations. The aim of these social studies was to promote the creation of public policies for the integration of indigenous communities into the new post-revolutionary national life. This implied an indigenism imposed by the intellectual leaders and institutions such as the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Public Education upon the different First Nations. In the section dedicated to, in the section on anthropologist Manuel Gamio's book, La Población del Valle de Teotihuacán, published in 1921, a collective research coordinated by him, and he was a subscriber of evolutionism. Lucio Mendieta y Núñez, a lawyer and later a sociologist, published the section on contemporary indigenous population in Teotihuacan, and he took on the key from Leon Diguet and so mostly Frederick Starr's photographs, front and profile. They are reminiscent of those images requested by Starr and also recall the seriality of Galton's composite portrait tables, or even those of the 18th century casta paintings set in grid-like boxes. In 1939, Lucio Mendieta y Núñez was appointed director of the Institute of Social Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. The origin of the Mexico Indígena Archive is inextricably linked to the institutionalization of the study of Mexican social reality at the university. This work of compiling a photographic atlas of examples of the entire indigenous population of Mexico served two purposes. On the one hand, to make a documentary inventory, which lent itself to the second purpose of helping construct the subjects who would be the objects of study of Mexican anthropology and sociology, and also the recipients of indigenist public policy. The first photographer to undertake the task of documentation for this archive in particular was the Honduran Raúl Estrada Discoa. You can see him here to your right. He trained at the former Academia de San Carlos, or National School of Fine Arts, in 1933 with the avant-garde photographer Agustín Jiménez. Estrada Discoa traveled throughout Mexico between 1939 and 1946, sometimes in the company of researchers from the Institute, sometimes alone, and visited villages where he photographed people, houses, daily collective activities, and landscapes. He almost never recorded with his camera people working in the fields, and never recorded ritual life in the communities. A very strange thing, considering that these were agrarian societies. And most of these people were dedicated to towing the land. So in some of the images in the extensive archive, originally it should have been about 10,000 negatives, and now it's down to about 6,000. Some have been lost. The subjects regain their agency by responding with a gesture, to the photographer's presence, or the rigidity of their pose is broken by the camera operator himself by taking portraits from a worm's point of view, as in those two images of the Cochimi men, which, as in the case of photography, which also emulate the case of Alexander Rodchenko and other Soviet constructivist photographs. And this point of view in particular, taken from way low, makes the subject larger and hieratic. The same year that he commissioned the archive, Mendieta y Núñez began publication of the Institute's journal, Revista Mexicana de Sociología, the Mexican Sociology Review, or journal. Photographs from the archive were published in a section entitled Exposición Ethnographic, ethnographic exposition. Other indigenous publications, such as the memoirs of the Department of Indigenous Affairs, created by President Cárdenas, published images of their intervention in the communities, even using photomontage. As you can see here, Cárdenas to one side, directing us to the past, which is represented here by the pre-Columbian art, and then all the population surrounding him. A very peculiar sort of populism that he exercised. Moreover, some photographs, as we can see, are highly reminiscent of 19th century costumbrista photography, such as that of the young man, while others remind us of candid amateur photographs or press images. Within the Institute, Another stream of physical anthropology brought from Europe began to receive greater attention, that is biotypology. Its followers, such as the Italian-born physical anthropologist Ada da Loggia and the physician José Gómez Robleda, carried out research correlating the study of facial expression, the functioning of internal organs, the shape of the body, elongated or plump, and the way the mind operated. In other words, a combination of endocrinology, anatomy, and psychiatry. Without going into great detail, in his studies of Tarascan fishermen, Otomi peoples of the state of Hidalgo, Zapotec Indians of the state of Oaxaca, José Gómez Robleda and his team updated the dialogues between photography, graphic, statistics, drawing, and text. He and his colleagues proposed that unlike the work of Italian biotypologists, such as Jacinto Viola and Nicola Pende, who had the classicist ideal body as the average type, that is the classicist Italian body as the average type, in Mexico, it was necessary to discern this average type or normal type for each ethnic group. Among other things, Gómez Robleda advocated a break with the racialist approach that were wreaking havoc as they did in Europe under the Third Reich. A characteristic of almost all of these typological portraits was that they lacked proper names. Such anonymity reinforced their quality as types representative of the entire ethnic group. Moreover, material culture, particularly the way of wearing hair and dress, especially the textiles that women made and wore, became a focus of attention in full-length portraits with backgrounds through which much additional information crept in unintentionally, as they were not all out of focus. Perhaps because of this, and to concentrate on the bodies themselves, when the photographs were published, they were edited to also erase parts of the context, as in the case of this Guave woman, reframed by the editor of the Revista Mexicana de Sociología. Local landscape and house forms also received much attention at a time when vernacular architecture was the subject of research. In 1951, for example, the School of Architecture, also at the National Autonomous University, exhibited photographic examples of vernacular architecture through the photographs from the archives. Objects, those that made up the so-called material culture for anthropology, also appear in the photographic record. On occasions, Estrada Dizcoa carried out avant-garde exercises whereby photographing a thing in a close-up and without any reference of scale, and as in this one, and in out-of-focus backgrounds. He turned out the most mundane things, such as a basket inside an Ixtle net, this one, into a sculptural object, or he edited the bodies, which, appearing fragmented, remind us of this modernist strategy of body fragmentation, as with the hand fragment that serves to show the huichol rings, or the hand that holds the hat that almost seems to be floating in the air. The photographer also managed to stage some shots like this one, in which the rhythms of the hats on the chairs construct a composition of uncommon visual interest, with the three chairs not centered in front of the doorway, and thanks to the contrast of textures between the wooden chairs, the wall, the material of the hats themselves, give us more of a feeling of rhythm. Although part of the life of this archive was spent in the pages of magazines, another part was lived in 1946 on the walls of the Palace of Fine Arts in the Exposición Etnográfica México Indígena, an exhibition designed to bring indigenous peoples closer to the inhabitants of the capital and shake their social indifference and shake their social indifference. Exhibitions in Europe and later at the MoMA in New York had already used the photograph enlarged to mural size or in smaller format as political propaganda. This exhibition in Mexico began with a journey through the indigenous origins of the country. Mexico, through photographs of pre-Columbian monuments and artifacts, was enhanced by the colonial heritage, and finally, the indigenous costumes and bodies themselves were highlighted. The didactic purpose for the school children can be seen in photographs of them, like here, the high school students taking notes from the notes on the walls, who spent hours copying the labels on the wall, an activity that many students still repeat even today. On the basis of certain topics in the Mexican indigenous imaginary, photographs from the archive coexisted with others of a more popular nature, as well as with more artistic images. One of the indigenous communities that received most attention and had the greatest presence in the indigenous imaginary was that of the women of Tehuantepec. And here we are going to see a small example, particularly of how the visual culture, this indigenous visual culture or imaginary, was built in the 1930s, 1940s. The visual culture surrounding the stereotype of the figure of the Zapotec women of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in the first half of the 20th century took the form of paintings, illustrations, and photographs. The Isthmus of Tehuantepec is a small region on the Pacific coast of the state of Oaxaca. So if this is the state of Oaxaca, this little place here is the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. The Isthmus of Tehuantepec in the Pacific coast of the state of Oaxaca, its two main cities were, and still are in a way, Tehuantepec and Juchitán. In popular black and white photography, some hand-colored examples serve to rescue the value of the portrait among broad sectors of the population. In the case of the portrait of women from the Isthmus, it served to underline the importance of the colorful hand-embroidered flowers on their elegant dresses. They were photographed in studios, and these are party dresses. These are not their everyday wear. They were photographed in studios with painted curtain backdrops or outdoors, standing on the dirt floor, poised against a modern backdrop with an airplane, alluring to tourism, as in here. Or their portraits included other elements of their wardrobe, such as the gold jewelry. You can see here, they're all wearing gold jewelry. All of them display that. And the hand-painted platter called jicalpextle. And these are the hand-painted platters, and they are made in the state of Oaxaca, the state of Guerrero, and even the state of Chiapas, which are the states that run here, here, and here, and they are very distinct in each of these regions. Tehuanas were constructed as sexualized through a male gaze. They were seen as exotic, as sensuous. Actresses, they were seen as exotic and sensuous. Actresses of variety show theater and national cinema of the 1920s and 30s embodied them, and periodicals reported on their dances, such as La Sandunga, and the way of swinging the large jicalpextle full of fruit on their heads, and in the gait that was characterized as slow, rhythmic, and erotic. Modern photographers, such as Luis Marquez Romay, recorded them with their camera, or, as illustrator Ernesto El Chango Garcia Cabral did, turned them into stylized Art Deco magazine covers. On her trip to the Isthmus, photographer Tina Modotti was spellbound by the presence of their bodies and the frankness of their smiles. Tina's image of the Tehuana with her jicalpextle in a bust portrait that goes beyond the frame of the photograph became one of the icons of modern photography in Mexico. And many of contemporary second half of the 20th century photographers had some sort of dialogue with this, I would say, founding image of Tehuananess. Of course, Estrada Vizcua, the photographer from Honduras who worked for Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales, also photographed them. And many of his images were published in the collective book Los Zapotecos. In graphic art and painting, they had already made a space for themselves very early on. So if we should trace a genealogy of the representation of Tehuana and Juchiteca women, we have to go back to this image made by Linati in 1828. As you can see, very, very early on. And this is a period when Tehuanas were not wearing the blouses we call huipiles, and were still going naked on their top part. Some of the groups that live along the coast, like the Wabe, still use, or Icots, as they call themselves, still, some women still don't use a shirt. It's very hot in that region. Who immortalized them, Linati, immortalized them in watercolors and lithographs, like the one we are seeing, where she still does not cover her breast with a huipil. In the second decade of the 20th century, Saturnino Herrán, a wonderful painter from the early 20th century, portrayed his wife dressed as a Tehuana. And artist Adolfo Besmogar stylized her in a mixture of Orientalism and popular earthenware decoration. You can see her here. She almost looks like a Middle Eastern miniature. And these are probably decorations taken from decorations in ceramic ware from Mexico. Diego Rivera painted them numerous times and in different techniques and supports. Here, for example, we see the oil on canvas in the dances from Tehuantepec, these two versions here. And we see the candy seller. This is a type of candy made with ground corn and sugar called pinole. And she is painted here in encaustic. Rivera was really wonderful managing materials and taking on several types of techniques. There were also popular figures in different frescoes in his murals in the public education ministry, like these two here. And in some of her portraits, Frida Kahlo emphasized her indigenous heritage by portraying herself as a Tehuana woman with a resplendor, that's the way the lace around her, the garment made with lace around her head is called, wearing one of the many chain-embroidered huipils that she collected. And this is the most common way they dress, with this everyday huipil or blouse. She collected these dresses, and like other women of the artistic cultural elite, usually wore them. The ethnologist, museographer, and painter and illustrator Miguel Covarrubias dedicated at least one book to them, Mexico South, published by North, in which he tried to reflect the everyday life of women of the Isthmus and their traditions. At the close of the decade of the 1930s, for the New York World Fair, The World of Tomorrow, Luis Marquez dressed different models as Tehuanas and portrayed them along spaces of the fair, even set against the American Express trolley. He also photographed models wearing his personal collection of indigenous clothing, posing in front of colonial buildings in a curious combination of cultural and material heritage with which Mexicans were intended to identify. In another photograph called La Visitación, The Visitation, Lola Alvarez Bravo portrays her friends. This, of course, is a direct quote of classical paintings, right? the Visitation of the Virgin, portrays her friends in a complicit embrace on a threshold, a transitional space between the half-lit area of the exterior and the half-lit area of the interior and the brightness of the outdoor. In a threshold was one of the visual elements that repeatedly attracted her. As an example of the Tehuana's presence in the cinema, we should remember that Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein dedicated the episode titled Sandunga to her in his unfinished film, Que Viva México. And I think you can find several versions of this in YouTube. As a final example, Tehuanas even made it or decorated postage stamps and even appeared on one side of the 10 pesos bill in the 1930s. And I hope that with this example, we can rescue a small fragment of the very complex indigenous visual fabric of the first half of the 20th century and the relationships between social disciplines, public policy, indigenous populations, photography, and modern arts. Let's take a leap closer to our time and look at two results of the experience of media transfer projects, in this case photography, to indigenous women. Around 1992, the nun Carlota Duarte started an educational project of photographic media transfer for indigenous people in Chiapas, in the state of Chiapas, with the support of a grant from Arts International. The book Camaristas emerged from this first experience and first exercise with disposable cameras, like the Fuji camera you see in this woman's hand. In 1995, she received a grant from the Ford Foundation and was invited by the Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios Sociales in Chiapas, that's the Center of Research and Social Studies in Chiapas, or CIESAS, to collaborate and found the Archivo Fotográfico Indígena, the Indigenous Photographic Archive, known here in Mexico simply as AFI by its beginning letters. Initially, Carlota gave out disposable instant cameras to create an experience of self-representation on their communities, themselves, or their culture. She then selected a small group of people whom she invited to make individual books in their own languages, in Spanish and in English. One of the participants since 1993, and you see here at least 3 participation from 3 different women, Juana López López, Xuncal López Díaz, and Maruch Santis. And we're going to concentrate on Maruch. For her first book, Maruch gathered a series of beliefs and sayings from her village near San Juan Chamula and inscribed the meaning of the sayings in simple images with sober compositions in ample grayscales. Her images have generally been linked to trilingual Tzotzil, Spanish, English texts, and thus from image-text complexes in which the original Tzotzil text does not completely elude us because of the translations. Maruch received attention from contemporary galleries, art galleries, such as Gallery OMR, and has also exhibited her work in important venues such as the Palace of Fine Arts and the Palacio Iturbide from Fomento Cultural Banamex. She has been the recipient of at least two government grants to support artistic creation, first in his modality for young people and later on for recognized women photographers. Maruch also experimented with computer image correction and color printing, as shown in this piece of a woman who puts in action precisely what the saying or belief proscribes, that is, you should not mend your clothes while you're wearing it, and she's shown doing just that. And you can see here by the way she crops the picture and the way she no longer turns to the aesthetic resource of black and white photography, but now is photographing in color. and also correcting her images in a computer. After her work on beliefs in 2015, she began another project that led to a new series in which the photographer explored traditional knowledge of herbal medicine with a sense of resistance against the use of herbicides in crops that in fact wipe out medicinal plants, many of them considered mere herbs. In addition, she has also recorded the interactions between members of the community carrying out important communal work, such as harvesting of coffee, in the transmission of women's own knowledge, such as embroidery, instilled in the girls from a very early age. I wanted to show you Maruch's photographs here as an example of the changes in anthropological and ethnographic representation in the first part of the 20th century, so that we are not left with the impression that racialist and racist photography still reigns supreme. In anthropology, from the 1960s onward, there were also interesting changes, although the entry of video and film displaced ethnographic photography. As we have been able to see through this talk, despite their scientific pretension, ethnographic images did not completely rid themselves of the syntax of graphic, plastic, and artistic photography. Perhaps that is why, to a large extent, an aestheticizing gaze has prevailed in Mexican ethnographic photography. It now remains for us to pay attention to what the indigenous visual producers themselves decide to photograph or film in their own communities, and to understand the native epistemologies that also underlie their images. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I don't know if you want to stop sharing. That's lovely, thank you. If you have questions, please do write them in the Q&A box now. That would be great. So Deborah, I was wondering how much involvement from people from these Indigenous groups have had in this area of research, if there's a sort of taking ownership of it to bring in the contextual information, bring back the context.
Well, as speaking from art history, at least, I mean, there are now more Indigenous intellectuals, of course, and they work in all sorts of professions and trades. And there are a decent number of photographers and especially filmmakers. I think ethnographic film has been one of the richest outs of this. We have a student, Alberto Cuevas, who is doing his PhD. He did his master's with us too in the art history graduate program in UNAM. And he is working with the first audiovisual archive in the Indigenous and National Indigenous Institute. What was the National Indigenous Institute? Now it has Instituto Nacional of the Indigenous Peoples or something like that. But it's the same place that does these policies and is the one prepared to make Indigenous policies. So he works on there, and he is also of Indigenous descent. We have another student that is working on representation of Zapotec women from the Sierra, not the coast, but the Sierra, and her family is from Yalalac, which is this community, and she's working on the value of textile. Ariadna Solis, a super bright woman, and she's doing a great job. So we do have not just Indigenous contemporary artists, we have Indigenous contemporary anthropologists, ethnologists, linguists, and activists. And I think that, in my opinion, we are far behind what First Peoples in Canada and Indigenous Native Americans are doing, activists are doing, and have been doing in the arts field. We have nothing compared to the Institute of American Indian Art. There are no places where indigenous people can have training in craft or contemporary art. I mean, that hasn't happened. So we did have similar indigenous policies, Canadians, North Americans, and Mexicans during the first half. And the history of the connections between that and the promotion of craft it's a great history. But we are behind. And I think that what is happening now, I see this globally, at least in Latin America, that the more you have indigenous artists producing contemporary art and not calling it indigenous art, but calling it contemporary art, and dealing with issues of indigeneity as contemporary art. And you are beginning to get indigenous curators as well, working with museums. You see this with the museum, the MACI, the Museum of Contemporary Art at the University of Sao Paulo. And you've seen this at the Pinacoteca de Sao Paulo as well. And you see this in other places of South America, like Ecuador and Colombia, and some degree in Peru, where there are now claims to take charge of their own visual production and their own visual self-representation. Doesn't mean that this representation won't be colonized, of course, because of the art market, right? So we'll see where it goes, but I think that in a way our place is to follow the development and be allies.
And be what, sorry?
And ally ourselves with them.
So yeah, there's this. I think this relates to Nathan's question. He says this is really important research that you're doing, and could you explore some of the ethical implications of this work, please?
Well, I have dealt with this in my publications. This was a presentation that was, of course, less academic for general public, but yeah, I have most of my articles and a book I published on the Lacandon rainforest and the representation of the Lacandon Indians in the 1940s. Also, you can download it for free. It's in Spanish, though, at the page of my institute and the homepage in the World Wide Web. And many people have reflected on what are the conditions of possibility of these types of images and what their uses were. So I think, yes, the ethical question is immense. I mean, there are types of photographs we can no longer reproduce because they are tied to the mechanisms of social control, and they are part of the biopolitical political campaigns of the post-revolution. So things have changed. But I think that with facial identification, I don't know how far we're going to go and what it's doing to the portrait. I mean, this is like the general prospect. So we have gone, the ethnographic photograph and the ethnographic portrait may be a place where you very visibly see this way of controlling bodies of other peoples. But think of visual identification and all these programs now that we have with artificial intelligence. And people take selfies, like they toast bread, left and right. So yeah, ethical implications are huge. And that is why we do need to go back to what is happening in a mere portrait and what portraiture does. I think that is the big issue. How is portraiture, as art historians, how is portraiture functioning today? And how has it functioned in the past, as far as political and social control goes?
Thank you. And then just as a final question, because we're sort of out of time now, Barbara was intrigued by the image behind you. So I wondered if you could speak about that, because we were chatting about this before the event started.
Okay, I will send you, and I hope the organizers, whom I thank sincerely for this invitation, and Verily also for trusting me and recommending me. This is the cover of the book on Mariana Jampolsky, though, because it's on the screen, it's flipped. It should be looking the other way. And it's for the book on Mariana Jampolsky, The Gesture of Photographing. And she was an expert of photographing human gestures. So now I think we are going more towards considering what is this embodied experience? How is the embodied experience of everybody's body being carried on in photography? And I think that is a really interesting aesthetic question. And it can be a political question as well. So please make sure you figure out the way to download the book. It's not self-evident. You have to click on the 3 little vertical dots at the top of the screen. And I will share with the organizers, as you know, when we come out of this conference, I will share with them the link. So please, everybody, download the book. It's a gorgeously designed book by Juan Leduc, and it was edited with Alejandra Perez Zamudio, the most wonderful editor at the Centro de la Imagen, and share it. So that's one of the photographs of this Maracame, which is shaman from the Virarica or Huichol group, Don Agustin Montoya. And that's his hands.
Thank you so much. We've actually put a link to the digital version of the book in the chat here, and then we'll also put it in an email to you with the feedback that we hope you can spend a few minutes to complete after the event. So that will come to you later. So thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you, everyone, for your questions, and Vila too. And
thank you so much.
Thank you. And the festival, the Art History Festival, continues throughout this week. So do check out our website, www.forarthistory.org.uk, to see what else we've got coming on. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.